I'd like to argue in this paper that more often than not, I think we misunderstand what we mean when we call for a new social contract. I want to draw attention to a pathological anthropology, an anthropology of autonomy, in fact, at the heart of classical social contract models. And I want to try towards the end of the paper to suggest an alternative to that pathological autonomy. Let's start with a quiz. What have all these organizations got in common? We've got the UN with its Secretary General, the World Economic Forum, the International Trade Union Federation, Extinction Rebellion, the British Conservative Party, the Loi Pacte in France, and so on and so on. Well, the answer is that all these groups have, in the last couple of years, called for a new social contract. But what does that rather abstract language mean? More often than not, when we study what these organizations say when they're asking for a new social contract, we see that they're wanting to freshen up regulations or introduce some new legislation, usually around work. So these organizations then are understanding the social contract as a legal argument. But I think this sells the idea of a social contract short. It's not just another law. It's not simply tighter regulation. A social contract is the context in which all laws and regulations have their valency. It's the solution in which they're all suspended, if you like, the frame within which they all appear. So we might think of the social contract then as a bridge between values and convictions on the one side, very abstract, ethereal, fundamental notions, and laws and policies, concrete laws and policies on the other. It's neither wholly abstract, nor is it utterly concrete. The social contract's about relationships. It's about what the state and corporations and individuals can expect of each other, or should be entitled to expect of each other. It's what they owe to each other. It's unwritten, almost always, but most people in a society have an intuitive sense of when it's being broken, as we saw very powerfully in recent months with the Black Lives Matter protests in the US and elsewhere. Drawing on Hannah Arendt's work, the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur argues in relation to John Rawls' influential version of contract theory, that the contract is underpinned and sustained by what he and Arendt call our will to live together, vouloir vivre ensemble. This is not a legal convention. Our understanding that we're part of a community, our desire to remain in that community is much more tacit than that. Ricoeur says this understanding comes from the level of ordinary conversation when it's spoken. But very often our will to live together remains unspoken. It's so buried that it only comes to the surface when it's contested by the degrading of the self, threatened by civil unrest, or defeated through military conquest or revolution. So then a contract can make visible, it can solemnify, and to some extent it can stabilize this will to live together. That's Ricoeur's argument, but it can't replace it. A contract alone is not sufficient to guarantee the will to live together. And under this umbrella term of the will to live together, we find an array of dispositions and attitudes that are upstream of legislation and regulation. Things like trust and reciprocity, goodwill, willingness to cooperate, transparency, and mutual sacrifice. Sacrifice in the sense that everyone surrenders a measure of our natural freedom to do whatever we want in exchange for the civic freedom, as Rousseau calls it, to live together. But having introduced this notion of sacrifice, I immediately want to problematize it because I think it can be really misleading. The truth is that entering a social agreement is never, I'm arguing, a surrender of autonomy or of independence, because no one is autonomous to begin with. No one sets their own laws to begin with. For one thing, as Michel Serres has so eloquently argued, we are all, are we not, parasitic on a planet on which we live for our air, our water, our nourishment, and on the sun for our light and energy. We have no choice but to obey its laws, the law of gravity, for example, the law of the conservation of energy, the linearity of the movement of time. Furthermore, if we want to drill down into the social world, we're not really autonomous there either. We're scarcely in a position to set our own rules of the game. As Ricoeur again points out, none of us writes our own story from day one. We're born into a particular domestic situation. We're born into a particular language or cluster of languages. We're born into a particular culture or array of cultures at a particular location on the globe at a particular point in history. And therefore, the fantasy that we can completely winkle ourselves out of this carapace of assumptions and prejudices is in fact eloquent testimony to the modern dream of divine neutrality that testifies more eloquently than anything else to our situatedness. Now, we could add to this list of ways in which we're not autonomous Jean-Luc Nancy's idea of singular plural being, for example, or his insistence in being singular plural on the Heideggerian Mitsein that's coeval with Dasein. And in the sense of the world, he says that the singulus, the purely singular being does not exist. And there would no doubt be other examples too. But what I want to focus on for the purposes of this paper is that both ecologically and socially, all of us are, so to speak, carried before we can walk. We're enmeshed before we can pretend to any autonomy. How curious it is then to find that at the very heart of the social contract idea, an idea that more than most has the potential to acknowledge our dependence on the world and on other people, right at the heart of this idea, there's an implicit anthropology that peddles an illusory, even delusional anthropology of autonomy. John Rawls' contracting parties, for example, have the luxury of contemplating their possible fate from behind a veil of ignorance. David Gautier and other modern social contract theorists, rational maximizers, are free to exercise their calculative will as they see fit. And even Thomas Hobbes' wretched creatures with their solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short lives are free to enter into the contract or to die seeking to fulfill their basest instincts. The subject of the classical social contract is an atomized, self-interested, mature, not aged, rational, economic, calculating utility maximizer who's in direct competition with all other similar subjects for a limited stock of endowments and resources. And if you lift the bonnet to reveal the workings of this rather unpleasant creature, who we find is the modern bourgeois male tradesman with no inconvenient dependents, no inconvenient family, and full access to the public sphere. Now, this implicit contractarian anthropology is one of the reasons why Carol Pateman, in her book, The Sexual Contract, insists that the social contract relies and reinforces what she calls a fundamental sexual contract. And it's why Charles Mills insists that the Western social contract similarly relies on an implicit pact of white supremacy. Oops. So who is this subject to the classical contract? It's been called Homo economicus, it's been called Homo rationalis, and these epithets have some explanatory power. But I want to suggest a different term today, one I think that captures more of this peculiar creature's nature. I want to call the subject of the modern social contract Homo deus, sporting this divine attribute of aseity or autonomous self-sufficiency, needing no one or nothing to be what he, and it is almost always he, is, and exercising a calculative rationality unmuddled by human weakness or failings. This happens to be a calculating sort of deity, but it can only afford that rational luxury because it's secured its position of perfect and untroubled autonomy, free from the messiness of being a creature with inconveniences like a family or bodily needs. Now, for this subject of the modern social contract, dependence is slavery and independence is freedom. And like anyone who thinks himself a god, this anthropology is illusory. But actually, I think it's worse than that. This anthropology of autonomy isn't just misplaced, it's pathological. Because we do have dependencies, do we not? And limits. And if we walk around as if we don't, then we end up banging into things or being swallowed up by them. And this is the point that Michel Serres makes at the beginning of his book, The Natural Contract, when he glosses this Goya canvas that you can see on the presentation, Fight with Cudgels from 1820 to 1823. Here we've got a splendid representation of the Hobbesian war of all against all. These two pugilists, oblivious to the fact that in their frenzied mutual aggression, they're both sinking into the marsh that's supporting the weight of their bodies. The fact that they think themselves autonomous, that they fancy themselves free to prosecute their petty squabbles is neither here nor there. They're sinking. And it's because the natural world has been airbrushed out of the contractual paradigm, as Serres is trying to illustrate here. It's developed an acosmic, disembodied and disembedded anthropology of rational calculation and monadic individuals who engage in relationships of exchange, seemingly without any responsibilities or dependencies at all. So Goya's pugilists then are laying the basis for an exclusionary contract. By denying their foundational and principal dependence on the earth that supports them, they open the door to all the other exclusions and discriminations on which Pateman and Mills so eloquently shine a light. So then, to quote Lenin, what is to be done? Well, we need a new account, I would suggest, of the social contract. One that starts not with this pathological, suicidal and murderous anthropology of autonomy, but with a recognition of the embeddedness, dependency and limits that characterize all of us. It's not that I begin as a sovereign autonomous being and then choose to enter a contract. Now, that supreme fantasy of independence is actually part of theology, not part of politics. The social contract is not a deal I strike. It is something that I recognize as being already there. I'm already bound to the world. I'm already bound to other people with bonds that I'm not at liberty to break. I can no more negotiate whether or not I'll fall to the ground when I walk off a cliff than can Wile E. Coyote. A good deal less, in fact. I can no more decide whether I'm born into an unequal and exploitative world than I can choose which part of the world I'm born into. The image that Michel Serres uses to try and capture this situatedness is the idea of cords or ropes that tie us to the natural world. He's a keen mountaineer himself, of course, and he has this image of mountaineers who are joined together with ropes, and he says that's the social contract. But these ropes, when you're climbing, are also tethered to the rock face, and that's what he calls the natural contract. And our only choice, therefore, is whether we acknowledge this tetheredness or not whether or not we are tethered. So the anthropology of the social contract then needs to be not homo deus, not the supreme unmoved mover who deigns to enter into agreements, but a homo parasitus, if you like, an always already needy, always already dependent symbiote who can choose either to recognize and embrace her dependencies or to ignore them at her peril. For homo deus, dependency was slavery and independence was freedom. But actually for homo parasitus, it is quite the reverse. To fancy oneself independent is actually the royal road to becoming inexorably enmeshed and eventually consumed by the stubborn dependencies that we seek manfully to ignore. But to embrace one's dependence, to seek to live in a complex symbiosis with the world and with other people, is a recipe for enjoying the freedom that only mutuality and dependence can bring. For homo parasitus, freedom and a cultivation of dependence grow in direct proportion to each other, whereas for homo deus, they're a zero-sum game. For the homo deus of the classical social contract, the market is the paradigm of all relationships. For the homo parasitus of what we might call the new social contract, it's the parent-child relationship that's paradigmatic. And we're all children before we're traders. We're all babies before we buy or bargain. Now, note the claim that I'm making here. Not that there is no market exchange, not that there is no calculative rationality, but that exchange and rationality always arrive at the party late, or always create for themselves a little short-lived island of calculative profit maximization in an ocean of parasitic dependency. Radical autonomy is pathological, and radical heteronomy, however, is hardly more attractive. But parasitism avoids both of these extremes with its regime of symbiosis rather than competition, symbiotic mutuality rather than zero-sum reciprocity. So then, as we call for a new social contract, I suggest that we can afford to mean nothing less than this, a call for a new anthropology. It won't do simply to tighten regulations around job protection. It won't do simply to pledge fairer income distribution or to sign up to alleviating global poverty. Roland Barthes had an astute question that he was fond of asking of any text. And it was a question that I had drummed into me as an undergraduate. The question is, qui parle? Who is speaking? And it's a question that I found over my undergraduate career could unmask a myriad of assumptions and manipulations. When it comes to the social contract, I think we could do worse than follow Barthes' reflex and ask a similar question. Qui signe? Who is signing the contract? Or in other words, who do we think we are? And this is why the renewal of the social contract can't simply be the province of politicians and legislators and international organizations alone. Because the sort of fundamental anthropological questions asked by philosophy need a place at the table if we're to avoid merely paying lip service to the sort of superficial reforms that the delusional autonomous homo deus is unfit to deliver. For if we don't understand that our dependency is fundamental to who we are, if we continue to entertain a pathological fantasy of our own autonomy, then we cannot even be sure of the ground beneath our feet. Thank you.